what are you protecting? Because the reality is that you are alone and you are under the heel of these billionaires just like everybody else. And sure, you have privilege, but the reality is that your material conditions are not much better than your black and brown neighbors, and you have every reason to unionize with them and, not just sympathize, but stand in solidarity,
Welcome to the Grub Grace podcast, where not all Christians are of the conservative type. We subscribe to the fact that there is more to this world and many rooms of thought within our faith traditions. This is a space for those who want to honestly ask the bigger questions outside of just accepting what your Sunday pastor or preferred social media influencer tells you about what is godly or what is not. By seeing patterns and calling out how religion has been used as a tool for empire, for colonization, genocide, and fascism, we can strive to reclaim our faith traditions, to be there for our communities rather than it being a plight. I'm your host, Mark Flower, and I'm joined today by activist and organizer Joseph Anthony DePice. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
So we're going to be talking about Christian Nationalism, Christofascism, and kind of the marriage of church and state and some of the problematic natures of that and how it's used by, like I said, empire for colonization, genocide, and all this, oppression and everything like that. I know we're going to be starting kind of on the idea of empathy. I think that's a good jumping off point to kind of jump into all this and how things have been kind of brewing over the last century, like last decades leading up to where we are right now. Do you have any kind of thoughts on empathy and kind of the attack on this emotion and what it does?
Yeah. I mean, I kind of want to, just give a little background on myself first, if that's all right.
Yeah, sorry, I just kind of jumped right in. I
just want folks to where, I think it's relevant to how I'll, respond. But I was raised in Calvary Chapel in Philadelphia, so evangelical for sure. And I grew up always kind of challenged by the lack of empathy that I experienced in those circles, right? Like the lack of curiosity that folks had about even just people like down the street that were struggling, but definitely, oppressed people or, folks from the global south that, the church, like you said, has been helping oppress for centuries, and so that's how I was raised, and it's been a journey to reconcile, because I shared with you before we started recording about how to reconcile this idea that we're supposed to love God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength with then all the limits of our culture, right, as a Western imperial country where the rules are that we're not supposed to care about the people that we're oppressing, and we're not supposed to question the structures of carceral violence and capitalism, racial capitalism in particular, obviously, so it was just like a personal and an ideological journey, I guess, because even just as a person, I struggled with severe depression, which in large part I attribute to my faith and just the guilt and shame, that the church can often be a source of, and especially in the context of, families where there's a lot of pressure to perform and so on. And there's varying levels. Obviously, it's nothing compared to the, colonization and violence that the church does to so many folks, but it does kind of help complicate in a productive way, I think, the narratives that we've been handed by the church so often, like you said in your intro too, these cookie cutter kind of narratives, and by leaning into my heart and my curiosity, I've just been on this kind of journey, and so anyway, I just wanted to kind of start there, but I'm happy to talk about, the broader context, if that's the right place to kind of transition here. I'll defer to you, brother.
I think that's a great way to transition into it. Let's talk about that broader context.
Yeah, so I guess I'm really challenged right now by the way in which, billionaires and families like the DeVos folks and so on have been able to weaponize Christianity to divide working people, basically scapegoating trans folks and immigrants so that we're not questioning why these billionaires, on the Epstein list, are making all of our lives varying degrees of hell. So, I think that that's kind of like, the other context is that, like, I don't know if you're familiar with the pastor Munther Isaac, the Palestinian Lutheran pastor, but he's confided or whatever he's shared, with folks that rather pastors at prominent churches around the country have shared that they want to speak out about like Palestinian rights, for instance, and the genocide, but that they have pressure basically from donors to not do so. So that's one example where empire continues to rear its ugly head in the church. But just broadly, the resistance to empathy or curiosity is, I think, what we're, focusing on, and how unproductive it is even for cis-het white, working people that are supposed to be benefiting from quote unquote, this system. And so it's just, it's really disturbing how effective it is, and especially, to hear people claiming Jesus, claiming, the gospel, and then doing the opposite, and like betraying, their neighbors, being unwilling to stand up when folks are being kidnapped, by ICE, and to speak out when there's a genocide. And this isn't, I won't say that this is limited to, evangelical or overtly like conservative churches, because my wife and I were at a pretty progressive Catholic church out here in SoCal, and we were actually pushed out because I was wearing my keffiyeh. We were in the worship team, and I'd been up on the altar doing some psalms, and so I was more visible. And this like liberal priest who would regularly talk about social justice and immigrant justice, basically said that you're not welcome if you wear the keffiyeh. And so, it's disturbing how prevalent this resistance to empathy and curiosity, so to speak, are, this aversion to conflict or to any kind of awkwardness, so to speak, when Jesus called us to, embrace the marginalized and the oppressed, and to set them free, literally, right? To fundamentally change society in a way that is, actually conducive to healing on a, large scale, not just on a one-by-one basis like he did for folks. So that's a little bit of my thinking on it.
Oh, I love that. And like, that's the thing about like in our system of capitalism is that, like you were saying, like pastors are, because of their donors or because of other pressures, like, their own reputation or their own, livelihood, if they feel like they say something, they're going against their donors will, back out, or possibly, if they say something, they fear that the congregation will leave them. And obviously they won't have a church and they'll be out of a job, or just, the fact that they might get too much criticism and they just don't want to deal with that, or just don't want that. It's like the irony of Jesus followers. Like, Jesus was so critical of institutions like this and people that chase money and whatnot. And yet here we are in this system that you get these Christ followers, but they're acting antithetical to the teachings of Jesus and the life of Jesus as what we see in the Bible.
That's right.
Yeah, it's just kind of ridiculous, the place we're in right now. Yeah, and especially with empathy too. There's a lot of like thought leaders that are pushing for this, attack on empathy. Like you had actually mentioned, like there wasn't enough empathy. And there's actually people that had actually commented on that over the last couple of decades, that there wasn't enough empathy in the church and there wasn't enough empathy in America. But now it's flipped, and now it's attack on empathy, saying there's too much empathy from progressives, from the left in general. And they just kind of categorize everybody with this. And it's like, okay, what's the narrative? Are we just going to keep flipping the script until something that fits within our tribe and within, politics of, wherever we stand? And it's just, I don't know. It's like, you have to kind of take on this dialectical thinking of like backing up, looking at things from a step back, and just asking all these questions like, who benefits from these, who, loses, what kind of system does it prop up, all this kind of stuff.
Yes. Yeah. It's definitely disturbing to look at the church in its, current configuration, and just to see like how far removed it is from, Jesus's commandments, from the Bible, like you said, and like for me, like Isaiah 58 and Matthew 23 have been like, chapters that just like have kept me interested. And I will say, like, it is wild, like, part of me, because of like my depression and my struggles with faith, like the mystery of evil, so to speak, was really what I was grappling with the most, I think, growing up. But like, it's hard to shake my faith, so to speak, like in those moments when I have wanted to be rid of it, so to speak, when it was like a cross to bear. And it's been liberating or encouraging to see that, like, there are people like in the liberation theology movement and even just around the world. Like, I know even some of the Black organizers in Alabama, for instance, that Dr. Robin Kelly has written about, like those folks used faith in a way that was like revolutionary. And there's so many examples. Obviously the early church, was an example in some ways. I know there's problematic pieces there, but like, I don't know. It's interesting to me that, our faith can be so like perverted in the way that we're seeing it play out with all this like, masculine, hyper masculine, like, pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist, whatever kind of a bent. But at the same time, fundamentally, it is liberating for people. It is liberating for, it's fundamentally supposed to be about helping, marginalized and oppressed people in its, true sense, right? Not that everyone needs it, but just in that sense. And so, I don't know, there's something really fascinating to me about this idea that, like, God can use us in spite of our doubt and so on, and in spite of the hypocrites that, are like the best at sort of claiming the faith and representing the faith, quote unquote, right? Every like part of these people's lives is draped in the flag, but the cross and like, the name of Jesus, while they are, doing these just perverted things. And I'm talking about like, Trump, I'm talking about, the Republican Party and just these prominent, conservative figures. But I don't know. I guess I'm just getting at this idea that like we have a right to Jesus, and that's kind of like what I've been working on in nurturing lefty community amongst Jesus followers or Christians. Is like, how do we reclaim the faith? How do we engage with the Bible, engage with, this rich tradition of resistance and to empire, resistance to evil, so to speak, and sustain ourselves through it. So I don't have like a polished answer there, but I am including you, I guess, in my journey.
No, that's quite all right. Yeah, and I'm gonna just take a moment here.
Yeah,
I was going to touch on how we got here with the church in general, like just the generations of what brought us here, and like the theology that kind of, primed the congregations, primed the people to accept, like, not just like fascism, but like, just the system that we have right now of capitalism, and how capitalism oppresses and destroys and whatnot the world around them in order for, personal gain, how the message is twisted to prime people to think that this is acceptable and okay, that this is just the norm, and they don't want to question that. Do you have any thoughts on like how the church has kind of done this?
Well, I think, I mentioned it earlier, but like Rachel Held Evans was somebody who was very helpful in my journey in terms of her writings. But realizing that we're the empire, so to speak, like from Star Wars or whatever, that America is in most scenarios globally the bad guy, it really cuts at what we were raised on, or at least I was, this idea that we're persecuted, right, as Christians. That's like constantly what I was raised on, at least, was just like everybody's trying to get us, like, just, constantly in this state. It's very Zionist, it fits perfectly with the Christian Zionist sort of bent, because it's like, we are the, especially as like, middle class white American Christians, like we have so much privilege, we have so much, entitlement, and yet we're constantly behaving as if we are just like being hunted and targeted at every turn. And so I think that like fundamentally our comfort and our, again, this, what we said at the beginning, this like resistance to ever being uncomfortable is kind of the issue, right? Because it's like, okay, you go to church, you go to brunch, you go to work, whatever, like you have your little rhythms and you don't really want to, feel bad, right? You don't want to think about what your country's doing abroad. You don't want to think about what it's doing down the street, what businesses and the billionaires are doing to people. Because, my church was in Philadelphia, and there's obviously a lot of folks that are struggling even just right there. Very close, not like blocks from where the building was, this mega church where 3,000 people every week would go, and just millions of dollars, moving through it. Mm. Yeah, so it's just like, I think that to me, what prime people, because I love that premise, for fascism and for this kind of thing is just comfort. Because if you look at Nazi Germany, right, what does everybody say? They were just doing their jobs. They were just keeping their heads down. They were trying not to think about the atrocities that were being committed. They were trying not to, consider. And that's exactly what's happening with these concentration camps being run by ICE, with the kidnappings, with the genocide that our country is facilitating. It's like people don't want to think about it, and they're mad at the messengers. They're mad at us for, in any way implicating them or making them feel uncomfortable, to the point where even, again, liberal or progressive Christians or Jesus followers will similarly, ostracize or, excommunicate us. It's very disappointing because fundamentally we were called to embrace a certain amount of sacrifice, especially if you're raised in evangelical spaces, again, where it's like everything's about holy war or whatever you want to call it, like a spiritual warfare, like that kind of thing. It's like, so what are people really sacrificing, right? And ultimately it's all this like Brene Brown, and she's cool, but like this kind of bull, so to speak, where it's like about personal growth and personal development and personal, but never about like how that should manifest in your relationship to your coworkers and your neighbors and the people that your country is oppressing or killing around the world. And so, it's just this very, I don't know if you've seen the movie Inception, you probably have, but like there's this quote in there that Tom Hardy says where he's like, you mustn't be afraid to dream a bit bigger, darling. And like, that's just like my whole thing with the Christians fundamentally, I think, is that like they're so small in how they view the world. It's just about their family and their country and their, little bubble. And it's sad because it's like they're missing out on joy. They're missing out on, liberation, community. It's not, and that's the thing that I think that gets missed because fundamentally they're always taught to fear difference and to fear, change and even on the left, like a lot of people are like, well, you're a Jesus freak or you're whatever, like, so you're a problem. And so there's not always space for people to grow and learn and become part of movements. But the reality is that if they are curious and humble, and if they do bring empathy, then they will potentially, experience just fulfillment on a level that they never could have imagined. But they won't allow themselves to go on that journey because they're so scared of what they might lose. They're so scared of risking, just like the pastors, of risking that community, that church family, that support. And especially when you think about how prevalent, Christianity is in this country, it's like maybe, your coworkers, your boss, your, landlord, like all these different people are in your church and are, part of that, structure. And so any kind of friction that you're part of is you risking, and this is like what we talk about with Israel too, where it's like, I don't have a lot of empathy for Israelis, but the reality is that the very few who do speak out, especially these young folks, like the trans person who was recently in prison, they are risking a lot by speaking out, and they should because they're colonizers, but they are risking a lot. And so just like when we empathize or, try to understand like cops here or, soldiers here and so on, it's like we can appreciate the economic and cultural factors that especially are prevalent for, black and brown working people, in motivating them to uphold these systems. But the reality is that ultimately we are all worse off if we are, practicing this racist, capitalist version of Christianity that has become the norm. Because again, we're missing out on the relationships, we're missing out on the liberation that we can be part of, the healing for, like you alluded to, not only ourselves and people around the world, but also the planet itself, because these systems are violent and terrible for every living thing, not even just us as people. So I'll get off my soapbox, but
no, I mean, oh my gosh, you just said a whole bunch, and it's just like, you're just not like, yeah, like, preach it. But yeah, I mean, you can look at like many churches throughout the past several decades, like back in like the 40s, 30s, 20s, like going way back. Many churches center their theology around like that authority is sacred, like hierarchy as God designed, obedience is the highest virtue, and like these teachings shaped instincts before they ever shaped opinions. We're even seeing now a push to say the word of this phrase, Christ is King, which wasn't as commonly used like 2 decades ago, but it's now being pushed quite a bit as this idea of king, and to soften the idea of having a king through proxy of Jesus. And it's just kind of perverting the whole church message. Like over time, authority becomes morally loaded. Leaders are framed as chosen. You see that with like Trump, and how many these faith leaders are showing him as like this, chosen person from God. Structures are framed as ordained. Challenging power feels disruptive. It's not discerning. Approval follows familiarity, not fruit. This framework also requires an enemy, and then for order to feel righteous, something must threaten it. So an enemy gives meaning to authority and urgency to obedience. And this enemy is very vague. It's flexible. It can be pretty much whatever it wants to be. I mean, back in like Jim Crow and everything, it was the idea of abolishing slavery, and then it was the idea of having white people and black people mixed together in like schools or water fountains or buses or whatever. And then you had women's rights, and then it was queer and gay lifestyles, and then there were and then now it's like trans issues, and now it's the left and Marxist and socialism and all that kind of stuff. It's flexible. It changes as it needs to keep people locked into the church. It's just, I don't know how people don't see this unless they're just not actively looking at what this system kind of creates.
Yep.
I don't know. It just it makes me sad a little bit. Like, I really hope that like a lot of my friends would just kind of open their eyes a little bit and kind of see what's going on. But this whole idea of empathy, what was I going to say about it? Because I know like Ali Beth Stuckey and Joe Rigney are kind of like the big like voices on the right to what's going on with all that. What was I going to say here? I had some notes that I was going to talk on for very specifically what she wrote in her book. Sorry, I have like this huge document, and it's like, I don't know where I put all my stuff in here. But if you have anything to say on what I just said, you can go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was beautiful. I'm just like receiving it. It was such a perfect explanation of how this is playing out, how that bigotry and just the fear, like the terror, how effective it is, and I like how you frame that about how versatile it is, or like I always talk about that with capitalism too. It's just like it's so flexible, it's so malleable, and as actual Jesus followers, as actual organizers and activists and so on, it's like really important that we be able to again have that kind of adaptive quality for what is good and what is righteous, because the reality is that like these systems, like that kind of Christianity and capitalism and so on, it's like they're very attractive, or the messengers are very attractive. They're very good at like selling that fear, selling that hate, and framing it as righteous, fury, or justified outrage, and we just have to put more emphasis, I think, on communication as a skill, and on, hand-holding, so to speak, because like we see with Trump in general, right, with working people, there is justified outrage about the state of our country, about the state of the economy, or conditions for working people, so to speak, but that anger is being misdirected. And just like with the church, like you're saying, all these examples, you know, there was frustration, there were challenges, but the reality is that it would have been better solved by actually, you know, embracing anti-racist and, you know, queer affirming and all these different, you know, on the flip side, all these like positive, you know, manifestations that would have made the church stronger. And but that have been twisted. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I just the fact that like the church has been this force of misinformation for so long, and like, yeah, I don't know. It's just like to your point about, you know, your friends and the frustration. It's like we are just so conditioned. We don't appreciate it really, I'll say, but like we are so conditioned, brother. It's like movies, TV, school, like our friends, our, you know, work, like everything in our society subliminally reinforces, you know, Christian supremacist, capitalist, imperialist, you know, sort of things. And until we start to, you know, unpack that in a supportive way, because again, that's something that I think gets lost, where it's like, you know, people talk about deconstruction and it's not always, you know, and I respect people who need to. Like I said, I've tried in my own way and I, you know, have been successful in certain ways, but it's like, you know, there's not always a lot of support for people who have questions, is I guess what I'm getting at, from the left and from, you know, Christianity broadly. And so it's interesting because it's like, if you're someone who was raised on these lies and in these circles, and you do have empathy and you do have curiosity, good luck, so to speak, because like, you know, it's not like you're going to be welcomed with open arms into progressive circles, so to speak, nor are you going to be, you know, supported in your church or, you know, your family and so on. And so I guess I am encouraged by spaces like this because, and I'm trying to nurture similar ones because I want people to have support for whatever their faith journey, so to speak, looks like, in particular with Christianity, whether that means that they, you know, continue to go to church and, you know, maybe like my wife and I lead worship or do, you know, all these different things, even as progressives, even as leftists or whatever. But, you know, it doesn't have to be that. And I just want people to have that, like, you know, support, because yeah, so much of this is unspoken. So many of these questions and conversations never actually happen. They just play out in our heads and we're isolated and you know, we just, again, like we keep saying, we just feel this pressure not to pull on the thread, not to act on these fears or these questions, when in reality it's healthy to, you know, exercise them, so to speak, or whatever, to work through them. And we just need to do it in community and you know, and to be okay with whatever the outcome is, to not be so capitalist in our faith journey where it's like outcome based, right? Everything's like about like, well, you know, how am I glorifying God? Like, what's the proof? What's the evidence? What's the, you know, because that's so much of the framework, right? It's like, what's the conversions? What's the number of, you know, souls saved, so to speak, or all these like, you know, very like limiting and small kind of like frameworks that aren't really about, you know, healing and justice and transformation, which are supposed to be the, you know, purposes of Christianity and faith broadly. So that's where I go with that.
No, I like that you're talking about the messengers and the space, that the lack of space within the church. Either, you know, if you have these questions or doubts and you're starting to do it, it's either squashed, or the term by Mark Wayne is the social judo, where they kind of flip the script and they mold it in a way so that it actually works to keep you within this cycle of not thinking outside the box. They kind of give you the answers. They say, no, it's okay to think. Let's think about it this way. And they kind of flip the script and they kind of give you the answers in a way while still making you think that you're thinking about it. You know, it's these messengers, like I mentioned, Ali Stuckey and Joe Rigney. So Joe Rigney wrote a not too long book, it's not long. It's like 180 pages or something like that. But it's called The Sin of Empathy. And then Ali Stuckey wrote one called Toxic Empathy. And that was kind of sprouted from the Me Too movement with the toxic masculinity and the critique on there. And she scoffs at it and, you know, said that it's just, you know, progressives and the left that are trying to take masculinity away, and the thing is there isn't enough masculinity, and there needs to be more masculinity, and it's just this whole ridiculous thing. But she wrote this book. It was called Toxic Masculinity, and she basically states that empathy isn't bad, but basically the left and progressives are using it in abundance demonstrative ways that are not helpful. And the way she describes empathy, she defines empathy, which is like pretty straightforward, is the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. But then her argument kind of goes off the rails a little bit. And she claims that empathy means not just understanding someone's feeling, but affirming those feelings and choices that come with them. So treating them as valid and good. So basically accepting everything about that person that you're having empathy for as truth and good, and that you just like you agree with everything, which is like, that's not empathy is to put yourself in the shoes of another, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to accept everything there. So the empathy literally comes from the Greek roots and pathos, meaning in feeling, but it's a mistake to assume that the word's origins actually determine what it means today. Words mean what people use them to mean. That shifts from, generation to generation. In some conservative biblical circles, though, there's a habit of treating original meanings as permanent authoritative. Language just doesn't work that way. So and what she does is she kind of squashes the term empathy with sympathy. And those two are similar, but they're different. And even the definition, like scholars and whatnot, they have a little trouble, defining empathy, but sympathy is a little bit better to define. But if you contrast the two, empathy and sympathy, empathy means being like in their feeling, like kind of putting yourself in their shoes in a way. And it's a way to resonate and try to understand a person. Whereas sympathy means that you're feeling with somebody. That's the more accepting of what they their ideas, their emotions, everything like that. And she conflates the two, and she says empathy when she's actually meaning sympathy. And it can be actually very dangerous when you do that, because what it does, it puts a blockade from people being able to try to understand somebody while conflating that with sympathy, while where that means agreeing with somebody, or at least walking with them in where they are. And so, like, critics have warned about dangers of empathy. What they're often really pushing back is sympathy, which I just said. And culturally, that's exactly what's happening. Over the past few decades, more Americans have extended sympathy toward groups like LGBTQ people, immigrants, and the poor, and others who were previously marginalized. The shift changes how society thinks about justice and morality. So for many conservative voices, that cultural shift feels like a loss of morality or moral authority and social power. Rhetoric about toxic empathy becomes less about empathy itself and more about drawing boundaries around those who deserve compassion and understanding. As is the case with high control religion, the central and fundamental issues here is power and control. And I think that's the key with all of this. The conservative opposition to empathy, it's not really about empathy, why it's dangerous. It's about maintaining the coercion and the social and cultural authority. Cultural authority traditionally experienced by high control Christianity with American society. It's about who we're allowed to empathize with and what happens when our sympathy extends beyond traditional limits. It's a concern that people sympathize with broader segments of society, and the sympathy threatens the control and traditional white Christians.
Amen. Preach, brother. Wow.
Yeah. And you also mentioned the idea of Christian persecution and how that's kind of like this complex within particularly white Christians, and kind of the loss of power. Like I was saying, it's that cultural shift and kind of fear of losing what they have.
That's it. That's it. Yeah. No, that is. Yeah.
There. Boom.
Yeah, because and that's the dangerous thing, right? Is like that idea of protecting what you have as what you have becomes increasingly smaller. If we look at working people, whether they're white or any other race, it's like, what the fuck? I'm pardon my language, but like, what are you protecting? Because the reality is that you are alone and you are under the heel of these billionaires, just like everybody else. And sure, you have privilege, but the reality is that your material conditions are not much better than your black and brown neighbors, and you have every reason to unionize with them and not just sympathize, but stand in solidarity. Interrupt the flow of capital, so to speak, and take action together to keep each other safe, whether they're immigrants, whether they're homeless folks, whether they're queer, it's so dangerous what you're bringing up, this fear of losing what we have, so to speak, as white Christians. And it's like, yeah, it's so obviously upsetting to me. And I think for good reason, because otherwise decent people are, what is it? If you can make people believe absurdities, then you can get them to commit atrocities. And it's like, I do believe in, Jesus, and I do believe in Christianity. I am just furious that, like, we broadly as white Christians are, brainwashed into this fear and this obsession with power and control, like you're saying. But it's like at our expense, so to speak, largely because we are not in control. We don't have the power. Sure, maybe like our mega church pastor or whoever has some power, but like you and I are not benefiting from that. And it's just like these sheep, whatever, with Donald Trump. Like, he doesn't care about you. He doesn't love you. He's not going to deliver for you. He hasn't delivered for you. And like, this limiting belief about that we are persecuted as white Christians, that we are, under attack, that we should not care about whether it's sympathize or empathize, we should not be invested in the well-being of our neighbors. And I take that in the broadest sense. It's like incredibly sad, man. It's incredibly sad. It's just like, pathetic. And like, I hate that these snake oil salesmen, can sell this, fear and try to make it seem academic and seem principled and, as you're saying, discerning and so on. It's disgusting. I hate it. I'm like, just so, it's Matthew 23. It's like, woe to them, right? These hypocrites. Because they could not be further, they are children of hell, as Jesus says, they are like enemies of just the most basic humanity and decency, and absolutely enemies of the true kingdom of heaven, the true, Christian movement. And it's just like, I don't know. I mean, I look at all these examples, like the Shiny Happy People. That was a really helpful show for me. But it's like, I just look at all these examples of people like you're talking about, these celebrities and these influencers, and the people literally, moving all this policy with Project 2025, the people behind Trump and behind, what's happening right now, this fascist, escalation. It's like, they could not be less Christian. And like, I don't care if they have amazing production value, if they have Hillsong, aesthetics and microphones and lights and all this stuff. Like, they're able to make people feel things and to pretend that it's the Holy Spirit. And the reality is that it's not. And it's the most diabolical sort of work, because they are actively driving people away from the work of healing, the work of justice and truth that we are called to. And I could go on and on, because it's really upsetting, because like, I like had this community finally of faith at this, Catholic church that we were at, and it was like we were singing the same songs that I'd sung at Calvary growing up, some of them, right? And it was a similar kind of like catharsis, just like the worship, which I love. But it was like, just like I felt at Calvary, like I can't do that in a space that I know is not supportive of real compassion or real empathy, real, grace, real, liberation, so to speak. And it's just like, it's soul crushing, honestly, that like there's so little room for these conversations and this kind of serious wrestling, like Jacob, so to speak, this serious like wrangling of, our call to faith, our, mission as Christians. And it's like, unless you drink that Kool-Aid, unless you are willing to just, embrace this like racist, sexist, homophobic, sort of culture, and not even necessarily in a passionate way. You don't have to like cheer for it, but you cannot say anything. You cannot push back at all. You cannot, it's like, then you're not welcome. And that is just so common, sadly. And you can play the game, like you can try to get by, for a certain amount of time, depending on your privilege in different church, spaces. But the reality is that, eventually you are going to come head to head with these systems as you start to have questions or challenges, especially if you're black or brown, and you don't have, the white sort of passing or privilege or whatever. And I don't know. It's just like devastating, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at. Because as somebody who was raised in the faith and someone who still, like I said, despite all my, wrestling, loves the faith and loves God, it's like I'm not welcome in, most churches. I'm not welcome in Christianity. And like, that's why this means so much to me. Like, these kind of, spaces, this kind of work, because it's like, it's supposed to be welcoming. It's supposed to be a place of healing and support and hope. And, like you can listen to any, right? You can tune into any Christian radio or influencer or whatever, and they're going to talk about encouragement. They're going to talk about hope and all these things. And it's like, if it's not for everybody, and if it's not in a way that is genuinely improving the quality of their lives, then how can you really say that it's, the work of God? If you're just doing it, in this very limited, very specific, very profitable way for you or for, your church or whatever, it's not the will of God. It's not, righteous. And yeah, brother, I don't know. It's just wild.
I can really sense your frustration, and I resonate with all of it.
I literally, yeah. Like I sat in my car, or I was driving home after the last time, because I didn't even want to go back to the church after the challenge that I had, and I'm sorry to go on, but like, and I was like shaking. I was like literally just overcome with emotion in the most like visceral way, because it was just like, oh my gosh, like what a disgusting thing that I thought I got away from, when I left that church that I grew up in. But it was like I reconnected with that joy and that hope that I get from worship, and I felt that community that I hadn't felt in a long time in being part of a church, and then it was just taken away again, and it was like I could have compartmentalized had I not gone back after that first thing. But my wife was like, no, you have one more psalm to do, to go up on the altar, do it, and so on. And I did, and it just tore me apart, because it was just like, I hate how far the church is from its mission, and I know I'm not alone. I know there's people that have suffered way more and continue to suffer way more at the hands of this Christian nationalist regime, but I do think it's worth sharing that in its entirety. So thank you for indulging me.
Yeah, and I think you really have been touching on some stuff, and there's a lot of frustration and a lot of critique that you can have against Christian nationalism and what's going on, especially with ICE and whatnot. But you touched on something of like, what can we do as Christians who want to follow the the red letters and really just
Amen.
do follow the life of Jesus and not just accept whatever your pastor tells you. There's this concept that I recently came across. It was like the glass shelf concept, that it's a metaphor for how people stack small doubts on a shelf over time. When the weight becomes too heavy over time, the shelf breaks and their worldview collapses in on itself. There will be a time for many people at over the course of these years that people will, their glass shelf will break. They just won't be able to have enough like cognitive dissonance or mental gymnastics to really just keep that shelf on the wall, and there will be so much put on it that it'll just break and shatter and fall off, and there needs to be a community of support that will welcome them in as where they're at, and to listen to them and welcome them in, and allow them to ask the big questions and kind of open that world to them. Do you have any like perspective how you see that might kind of play out and be helpful to people coming out of that space?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm obviously getting at too. Just like, how do we create that space, that support? Because like you said, there's so much judo and gymnastics and stuff where it's like, well, bad things happen, but basically God is good and you are, immature, so to speak. You need to grow more in your faith or whatever. Like, there's just not a ton of room for real wrestling on that level of especially the political implications of our faith or ripples of it. But I don't know. I mean, I guess we're doing what we can right now here, and like, I just want to keep being supportive of people, because I'm not precious about my faith anymore, right? That's something really big that shifted, is like, I love God with all my heart, but I don't feel the need to convince people. And it's childish, right? Like, to say like, or to admit like, oh yeah, like I used to just feel this pressure all the time, like, oh, if so and so doesn't, believe in God before they die or whatever, then they're gonna go to hell. Like, and I really felt that in my heart still. Like, I was 20, whatever. I was like, a grown man, an adult of some kind, and it's like, why was I like carrying all that and like all this homophobia or all this, just bigotry, whatever, fear? And it wasn't like, oh, I was, that way, but it's just like, I was fed all this stuff and I was just having to like unpack it, and it was awkward because it's like, you're in these lefty or whatever progressive spaces and you don't want to say like, oh, I thought that like you were sinful and I thought you were like the enemy and I thought whatever. And it's like, I can't like really feel that because I relate to these people that are around me, that I meet. And so it's like, so much of this I feel like is just isolation, because oftentimes, but it's a relationship between empathy as well. But a lot of it is, isolation, because like, in cities, people encounter difference all the time. Like, you have people that are very different and you have to get along at least to get through your day, like on some level. But a lot of like, these Christians that we're talking about are in rural communities and they're isolated, and they, because of redlining and just racism, they don't have to interact with people of color, people that are different from them, queer people, or at least visibly, queer people. And so it's like, yeah, I don't know. I want more Christians, to experience just community in a larger sense. And then I want them to feel supported in that, because it is going to be messy. You're going to say the wrong thing. You're going to get quote unquote canceled. Like, there's going to be moments where it's like, you feel really, awkward and bad. And it's like, I don't think that that's super productive. Like, we don't want people stuck in that, and we don't want people feeling this guilt and shame, because I say it all the time. I'm like, I could have stayed fundamentalist, libertarian or whatever, if I needed this like, righteous, self-righteous, stuff that happens on the left all the time, and that these social media platforms incubate, just this divisiveness and so on. But it's like, yeah, how do we, you and I, especially and progressive, Christians, how do we create the space for other people to deconstruct, and to reconstruct at their, own leisure, discretion, or whatever, without an agenda of like getting them to some place or into some, thing that we control, and rather just how do we support them and help them to, love God and fulfill His commandments in a way that is actually true and fruitful in the fullest sense. So yeah, I don't know the answer at all, and I think we're finding it together, and just just being real about that, being transparent in our own journeys is the answer, because then we'll be attractive, we'll be able to reach people, and like people like me, at least in particular, that like I was raised in that very much, like you said, high like power and control culture, and like, it's all about like performance and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, yeah, it's so toxic for a human, to live that way. And then it's so toxic as an ideology and as a, way of going through the world, because you're just constantly thinking about how to advance yourself and grow yourself. And nothing could be further from the gospel, about, just the love and the, selflessness that we're supposed to be, espousing. And so, yeah, I'm here to be transparent, like I said, and to be, supportive for folks who are learning and growing. And yeah, I don't know. I think something that was helpful for me when I was still in the evangelical or when I was earlier on in my deconstruction, was to realize that like, it's not a monolith, that like every Sunday when you're at church, and or when it happens that your pastor says something hateful, or that you notice that, and you'll do it more obviously as you grow, but like you'll notice these things, just you have to realize that like people are feeling challenged by it. You're not alone. There are other people that don't appreciate how it went down or whatever, and like they just don't feel, like we keep saying, they don't feel safe, they don't feel the power to speak up about it, but they do have that sense. And so, it's just about people feeling supported, because like, I'll give you an example. At that church that we left, one time there was another pastor, not the liberal one, who was going on and on about Trump and about abortion and stuff before the election. And people in the congregation, which is a very liberal or conservative, whatever, just middle of the road, kind of a an institution, not at all radical. People literally stood up and interrupted the mass and stopped him and said, "You should not be using the pulpit this way," or whatever, the altar, and so people can surprise you, but I think that your fellow Christian brethren, I'm saying specifically, even if you think that they're all like super conservative and whatnot, they can surprise you, and you just have to gradually, I would say, be more open in your journey of like deconstruction or reconstruction, and then you will be giving permission to them to join you and to be supported, because that's really the key. Like, we can support you remotely and we can introduce you to other people that are going through this, but like, you have to stay. And I like that Pastor Mother Isaac, the Palestinian pastor, said that to us, which was very helpful to my wife and I, that like, we should not abandon the church completely. We should stay to the degree that we can, that it's not like it was super toxic, and I couldn't in my case, but like, to the degree that we can, we should try to stay in these spaces, and that's part of what I'm doing here, and not let the fascists, not let these capitalists or con artists control the faith, control the presentation of it, and really try to remind people and give people permission to true call of Jesus, to befriend the people in our community who are even more oppressed than we are and who are even more marginalized than we are, because we all have claim to some version of oppression in this capitalist hellscape. So that's where I'm gonna leave it.
No, I love that. Yeah. No, I love it. I love everything you said. And I've been in this deconstruction space for a while of, like, kind of coming to this, like, it's almost like a snap of the fingers. It's like asking these big questions, like, why is it the way that this is? Why am I still taking this on? This isn't helpful. This is harmful. And when I started doing that, it's been years now, but like, I still feel this kind of pull towards this old, like, foundational way of how I grew up in this very conservative kind of, mindset and community and everything like that. And I think that gives me a little bit of empathy and and understanding for people that might, like my friends that are still in there. And like you were saying, like, people might surprise you. I've had friends that do surprise me and have, I thought they thought one way, and they come out and start talking, and I'm like, all right, you surprised me. You are like a 180 of what I thought, my presuppositions were about you. And, that's helped me to understand that, obviously don't judge. I mean, that's like a biblical thing there, but, like, don't judge people very rashly and fast like. So it's, but when I still think about, like this, where I was, it was like, kind of what I was talking about, this, like, common enemy and whatnot. There's this David Foster Wallace quote that says, nothing brings you together like a common enemy. And I always think about that quote whenever I'm like, thinking about like the fundamental space and the biblical literalists and people within this church world, like that, this kind of more what I would think is narrow view of what the Bible is saying and our faith traditions. And it's kind of like Tim Whitaker, he says, you're in the basement of fundamentalism, and then once you finally walk up the stairs, open the door out of the basement, you see that there's all these other rooms within the faith tradition, all these other ways of thinking, and it just like kind of blows your mind a little bit. It's a little overwhelming, but once you start kind of taking your time and kind of going into things a little bit, asking these big questions and looking back and seeing where you came from, you start to kind of understand a little more. You start to kind of work things together. You kind of start to see where these puzzle pieces fit, these patterns. You start to have this pattern recognition, kind of like I was talking about dialectical thinking, and asking these big questions. So yeah, and then you were kind of touching on something that made me think of a Martin Luther King Jr. quote. I'd said it on one of my previous episodes. I think it was my Easter episode last year. But he says, "The white poor also suffered deprivation and the humiliation of poverty, if not for color. They are chained by the weight of discrimination through its back." And you have been talking about how so often people marginalized are the ones that are the enemy. They're the ones that are attacked. Brown people, you got people within the LGBTQ plus community queer, trans people, and just all, like, even women. You can categorize women in there. Women are highly subjugated within the church, although a lot of church leaders might be like, whoa, women are equal, but the theology says otherwise, especially if you look at like Doug Wilson and in proxy Pete Hegseth through his ministries. But white people are subjugated just as much as these marginalized people and these villainized people by the church so often. And white people don't necessarily see it. It's like they got this veil over their face. They got this this priority within America and the system they created.
They're oppressed in the same way economically, at least, because
yes.
Yeah, and that's what the church runs so much cover for.
Sorry,
because
it's like I definitely didn't want to.
You shouldn't be focused on this world. You shouldn't be focused on your economics. And it's like, really, I shouldn't care about being able to put food on the table and keep a roof over my It's just such a toxic thing that is so common. But again. My mom's somebody who raised me like that, like everything's spiritual warfare and just the libertarian, kind of thinking basically. But she's come around and she's learned about Palestine. She's learned about all these things through me. And if I had just, like you're saying, written her off and judged her harshly and quickly and whatever, then we wouldn't have the relationship that we do, and she wouldn't be able to reach more people that I can't reach with, Reconstruction or whatever you want to call it, this progressive, message about the faith, this, like you said at the beginning, this encouragement to not just take what your pastor's saying at face value, as they always say, at least in the Calvary things. I keep thinking about it when you keep saying that oh, don't trust me, read your Bible or whatever. I'm like, yeah, I am. And the reality is starkly different from the biblical and stuff that you have been feeding us.
Yeah. And I mean, even if you, aside from just looking at the Bible and just questioning and reading it, and like you were saying, like I am reading the Bible and I'm not seeing what you're seeing. I'm seeing what you're seeing, but that's one interpretation of it. And it's a very demonstrative depth.
Yeah, well, they're not focused on the ones that we, it's like we're not exactly. And it's not it's kind of like Joe Rogan or Gavin Newsom or whatever saying, oh, well, we have all kinds of people on the podcast. It's like, no, most churches have one kind of interpretation that they present as the only interpretation, and they are not generally having on people with different perspectives, or they're not generally entertaining views that are different than their own. It's just incredibly deceitful, incredibly manipulative, and harmful for all of us, because we need each other as working people. We will not be, like you said about, material analysis, it's like we will not be okay on any level, economically, environmentally, politically. We will not be okay if we continue to, stay in our holes as white people, as white Christians, and just think about how to best serve ourselves or our church or whatever. It's not a winning strategy for, what is it, a purpose-driven life or a better life for ourselves.
Yeah, but what I was saying is looking outside of just reading the Bible and whatnot, and just talking to other people. Even if you look at the stats and everything like that, the statistics and whatnot. I don't know if you know anything about PRRI. I think it's Public Religious Something Institute. But they've been doing a lot of data collection and analysis of religious institutions and trying to figure out the correlations and whatnot of different faith backgrounds. But they did a whole thing on Christian Nationalism. And so they have these 5 questions that they ask people, and then they come back with, do you agree or do you not disagree? So number 1 is, do you agree whether or not that the U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation? Number 2 is, should U.S. law be based on Christian values? Number 3, if the U.S. moves away from Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Number 4, being Christian is an important part of being truly American. And number 5, God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of society. The last one is very closely tied to the New Apostolic Reformation, which is Doug Wilson, all that kind of stuff. The 7 Mountain Mandates, the spheres of influence, all that kind of stuff. But people were asked, like, do you agree or disagree? And based on how they respond, they grade you. What is it? Are you a Christian nationalist adherent? Are you a Christian nationalist supporter, or are you what is the other term they use? I think a skeptical. So a Christian nationalist skeptic, and a denier, Christian national denier, or something like that. But I think roughly about 32% of Americans are Christian nationalists, either supporters or adherents, which is a frightening number. But I mean, that's still a minority. That's still something that if people were to wake up and actually know what to look for and understand the rhetoric and the lingo, and listen to platforms like ours and talk to people and try to decipher all this kind of stuff, it would be a little bit better with trying to combat a lot of this really dangerous stuff that's really pushing kind of the American agenda as far as like imperialism and the empire. And honestly, I think that it would put a halt on things like funding genocide in Palestine or putting the weapons.
Go off, King. I don't know if you're a fan of Andor, but it's not a foregone conclusion. That's like the big thing. Again, like I said about about your neighbors at church and your fellow parishioners and so on. It's like fascism, capitalism, Christian nationalism. These systems require constant reinforcement. They spend millions. Look at Israel with the propaganda. Like, we don't realize that's a big part of this is the Brene Brown thing on a serious note, which is like, we don't appreciate that we have agency, that we have a voice, that we matter. Like you said about obedience, it's a very dangerous part of this thing that I should have brought up sooner, but it's like people are taught to feel small and to be, isolated, to be feeling, ironically, even though they're in community and they're, whatnot, but they're supposed to feel like, just they have no power. They have to submit to their husband, their pastor, their, president, their whatever. And it's like the most important part of organizing is just listening to people and making them feel like they matter. And those 32% can be absolutely fragmented and taken down, so to speak, in a positive way and be brought into the revolutionary, community, because so many of them just feel like their identity is enmeshed with these systems and that they can't deviate, they can't, like we keep saying, but specifically because they feel small, they feel they must be obedient, they feel like this just limit in themselves, and it's like, no, you matter and you have a voice. And that's why, again, like, you might not hear it from progressives, you might not hear it from your woke coworkers or whoever, but the reality is that it's good for you to get egg on your face, be embarrassed, ask a question, start a conversation, and it's dangerous for the systems. And like, I went through this with my aunt and uncle recently, who are like kind of conservative as well, but like, they have been like meeting people even in their own church who are different, who, have different experiences, people of color, working people, queer people, whatever, like, and it helps every time you are willing to go out on that limb and make that connection and ask that question, because you are showing yourself and you are showing them that you have agency, you have, the ability to question and challenge and participate. Because what is the point of a faith practice if you don't get to, bring your full self to it, if you don't get to, be whole and be seen and heard and valued. And so that is the other piece here that is often missing, which is that like this kind of Christianity is inherently toxic even for you, because as a practitioner or as an adherent or whatever, of it, this Christian nationalism is harmful for you because it makes your world smaller and your, brain and everything limited. And so, just even if you think about it on a somewhat selfish level, it's healthy, it's okay. Like, and again, that's the other part of this. It's like, it's okay that you have needs, that you have, a voice, that you have thoughts, that you have like, because so much of this stuff just goes back to us seeing ourselves as sinful and needing of, this rehabilitation, which is in some ways helpful, but it's often weaponized against, this kind of rigorous engagement with our faith and with the scriptures. because, we're told, oh, we just need to submit. We just need to, accept this narrative that's being fed to us. And that is not being a good Christian at all.
No, definitely not. Honestly, I think this last little part that you said, I feel like that's a good place to end. But I want to open it in case you want to talk about anything else. I know you had mentioned ICE before. Did you want to cover ICE at all, or?
I mean, I don't really have a. I was just kind of getting at like the fact that what we've been talking about in terms of how there's a crisis happening in our communities where people are being kidnapped. Our immigrant neighbors and family and friends are being taken, and a lot of people are cheering it on. Like these folks, I'm sure that you're alluding to, these Christian nationalist leaders. They're cheering it on, and certainly. Xtian and so on. And that's just so gross to think about, like Xtian or the DeVos family, Eric Prince of Blackwater, these people being part of our church, and like community. And yeah, it's just disgusting. And like, I don't know. I think that what happened at the church in Minneapolis, maybe that's a good, example of what needs to be done, where people stand up and push back, and it doesn't always have to be that dramatic where you interrupt a service, but certainly if your pastor or anyone in leadership or that in your church family is an ICE agent or related to an ICE agent, the very least you can do is some good old shaming, some good old fashioned we all know how to do that very well as Christians, and yeah, it's just it's not okay. There's concentration camps. There's, slave labor that's occurring as a outcome of these kidnappings, in addition to the violence of the kidnappings and the horrible conditions that folks are enduring in these camps, these detention centers. So, yeah, I don't know. It's just like, I don't want us as Christians to be turning a blind eye to what's being done, especially when it's being done by people who are claiming our faith and are saying that they're doing it for safety and for noble purposes, when the reality is that overwhelmingly the folks that they're taking are not criminals. And, in the rare cases that they always point to where folks do commit crimes, they are prosecuted by law enforcement. There's a lie that keeps being brought up that Biden and whoever else were sheltering, the rare immigrants who were criminals. And the reality is no, there are lots of cases, or, there's a handful of cases where the, folks who are doing crimes, the immigrants who are doing crimes, are caught and put in prison like anybody else. So there's this whole narrative about that they're taking dangerous folks off the streets is nonsense. And yeah, I mean, the Bible is very clear. I love that, reclaiming that one. The Bible is very clear about how we're supposed to treat our neighbors, our immigrant neighbors, specifically the strangers in our community, so to speak. And it is the opposite of what Donald Trump and his cronies are doing.
Yeah, and I think it's good that we give people the right tools. I mean, there's a lot of terminology that we've used just in this episode alone, which I encourage. If there's something that you don't understand, like you hear us say something, pause this episode and look it up. I mean, go back and listen to the different terminology that we use, and
reach out to us. We want to talk to you. We want to connect.
Yeah. And also combating false narratives, like the thing that you mentioned about the church, the common narrative, especially within conservative or right wing circles, is that they just barged in and started yelling at the pastor and accusing him of things when that couldn't be farther from the truth. That was a portion of what happened. What happened was they actually sat through the entire service. At the end of the service, that's when they stood up and they confronted the pastor about it. But then the news and social media,
I didn't even know that.
And everything like that conflates it into this, this is just a very small portion of it, and we're going to focus on this, and we're just going to push this idea that they are disruptive and they are an angry mob, and we're just going to go with this narrative of that. Also, like other tools, like you were talking about, how the majority of people who are pulled off the street by ICE are not criminals. I don't know if you know about the Cato Institute. So the Cato Institute is a conservative leading libertarian publication, and they came out with these statistics of who's been detained by ICE and who's criminals versus who are not. And basically it came out that 73% of people who were detained by ICE had no convictions, no criminal I would recommend, this is another tool. Check out the Cato Institute. Google Cato Institute. I think the title is 5% of people detained by ICE have violent convictions, 73% no convictions. So if you just Google that title with the Cato Institute, you'll find this whole article. They have all the statistics. They show, they break it down as far as even across the entire last year,
and people detained,
and it's I think it's there's this one here that's so ICE detainees arrested by ICE have no criminal charges or criminal convictions rose 2,370% since February to November. That is insane of how many people with no convictions whatsoever who have been detained by ICE. They're just pulling people off the street based on
and it's cruel and unusual. Amen. The color of their skin, the accent, it's been proven. That's right. And this is cruel and unusual punishment. It's torture. If you do any digging about these conditions, and you probably have a concentration camp in your neighborhood, in your state for sure, but
if not,
you don't. I'm sorry?
If they don't already have one, they're building it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really not okay. The conditions, it's horrible. The hygiene, the food, the sexual assault, just it runs the gamut. And they're using these companies, Geo Group and Core Civic, these giant, multinational prison, private prison companies and detention companies. They are profiting from labor from these folks too. They are using them as slave labor, and even for staff, the conditions are not good at these places. They are often very dangerous, and a lot of the similar, sort of issues that are happening with the detainees are also happening with staff. So, these are just incredibly toxic enterprises. And I promise you that, especially with Core Civic, that's headquartered in Tennessee, that leadership of that company go to church and have church community and make donations and so on. And it's it's really not okay, the level of acceptance that we have for these folks, specifically this Geo Group and Core Civic, these companies. It should be as toxic as being an ICE agent if you are involved in these companies, if you are doing anything to facilitate this regime. And that goes for, the influencers that are cheering it on and all this kind of, it's just you cannot call yourself a follower of Christ, as far as we're concerned, if you are in any way espousing or upholding what's happening right now with ICE to our immigrant neighbors. So, I appreciate you allowing me to speak on that and adding, what you did. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, and I'm sure we can go into a whole thing about the industrial prison complex and how it's such a for-profit and how it's all privatized and everything like that. But, there's a whole bunch you could probably go on that.
Amen.
But I don't want to take up too much of your time. I don't know how much time you have left, but I know you have something that you had to get to in a little bit too. So this might be a good spot to end it. But it's like we're saying, these are all tools. Use us as tools. Reach out to us. Google things smartly.
Yep.
Use specific words and what to find exactly what you want, because Google can be unreliable. If you just throw in one keyword, you can find a whole slew of stuff where money has backed to bury other things. So
and try to de-Google. You can try to use other engines, because Google is absolutely complicit in a lot of this. So it's a process. I'm not a woke scold. I hope that comes through, that I am here to support and be transparent about my journey. And I think it's really helpful for us to acknowledge, like you said, where we've come from and not to hide or, try to be ashamed or whatever. So just for what it's worth, try to step away. Go gradually, but Ecosia is what I use. But there's plenty of alternatives and I don't know. It's just one of those things. I understand that, we can't all boycott everything and we shouldn't, necessarily. But Google in particular is just, a particularly problematic entity. So.
For sure. Well, Joseph, thanks for coming on. I want to give a chance for the listeners, if they want to find you or find more stuff, if you're active on social media, where can people find you?
Yeah, Anthony DePice. My first name is Joseph, but I go by my middle, which is Anthony. So Anthony DePice down there on the screen. It's pretty much me everywhere. And thanks again, Mark. This was such a blessing. Seriously, love and appreciate you.
Yeah, appreciate you. Is there anything else that you might want to like pitch or anything like that or promote?
No, just like you said, reach out, be in community. Yeah, love and solidarity to everybody.
Love and solidarity, and let's collectivize.
Amen.
All right, man. Thanks again.
Thanks so much.